Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Astral channel. Today we're going to be talking about space and the Van Allen belts. Okay, what is space actually, and what are the Van Allen belts actually? And it's not really what you think they are. You know, most people are taught that the Van Allen belts are zones of trapped radiation surrounding Earth discovered during the early space age. And according to the official science, they're simply charged particles held in place by Earth's magnetic field, dangerous but natural. Nothing more than a side effect of solar wind interacting with our planet. But this explanation is incomplete at best and intentionally misleading at worst. And you're actually looking at something that is just not a radiation field. It's part of a controlled energetic barrier system, one that plays a direct role in consciousness, perception, and the containment of the human experience. The Van Allen belts are more than physical radiation. They are a frequency barrier, a kind of energetic membrane that surrounds Earth. Think of it like this. Reality, as explained by Yazzie, is not truly physical in the way that we think it is. It's frequency-based. Everything you see, touch, and experience is a result of consciousness interpreting vibrations. So if you want to control a reality, you don't just control matter, you control frequency. And that's exactly what this barrier does. The Van Allen belts act as a containment field for specific frequencies, especially those associated with what we call 3D Earth perception. Now this is where things start connecting. The moon is not a natural satellite. It's an artificial object, a biosphere ship, placed in orbit around Earth. Its purpose is not just gravitational stabilization, but frequency control and projection. The Van Allen belts are directly tied into that system. Okay? The moon projects and stabilizes a frequency range, and the belts act like a reinforcing shell around the planet, ensuring that frequency stays contained and consistent. Together, they form a closed energetic circuit. So instead of thinking of Earth as just a planet floating in space, think of it more like a contained frequency environment, almost like a terrarium for consciousness. One of the biggest implications of this is travel. Official narratives say space travel is difficult because of distance and fuel and radiation. But one of the real obstacles is frequency mismatch. The Van Allen belts are part of that. They act like an energetic filter. Anything trying to leave or enter Earth must pass through this barrier. And that barrier is not neutral. It's tuned to maintain the Earth experience as it is. So if a spacecraft or even a consciousness is not aligned with the frequency parameters of the system, it will experience interference. Basically, if your vibration isn't high enough, you won't be able to pass through. This has to do with the astral, okay? But this is why advanced civilizations don't travel using brute force rockets. They use frequency-based navigation, shifting their vibration to match or bypass barriers like this. In other words, you don't break through the system, you tune out of it. Okay? Now let's go deeper. The Van Allen belts are also connected to the idea of memory suppression. When a soul incarnates into Earth, it undergoes a kind of forgetfulness. You don't remember who you were, where you came from, or what you've experienced before. Mainstream spirituality often attributes this to the veil, but the veil is not just an abstract concept. It has a mechanical component. The Van Allen belts are part of that mechanism. They contribute to maintaining the frequency range that suppresses higher awareness and broader memory recall. They help stabilize the illusion of separation, linear time, and limited identity. So it's not just that you forget, it's that the environment itself is designed to keep you forgetting. When you put all this together, you start to see a pattern. The Earth system is semi-closed, not completely sealed, but controlled. The Van Allen belts function as the outer boundary of that control system. They're like the walls of a frequency container, ensuring that the internal environment remains stable and predictable. Inside the system, you get linear time perception, limited sensory range, strong identification with the body, emotional loops and repeated patterns, and difficulty accessing higher states of awareness. All of that is not just psychological, it's environmental. Okay? Let's talk about why NASA doesn't talk about this stuff. The reason mainstream science doesn't acknowledge any of this is simple. Because the official narrative is designed to keep everything within a materialist framework. If the Van Allen belts are just radiation, then there's nothing to question. They become a technical problem, something that engineers need to solve. But if they're part of a consciousness control system, then everything changes. And this is what they don't want you to know, okay? They don't want you to know that it's part of a consciousness control system, okay? Because then suddenly space is not what you thought it was. Earth is not what you thought it was. And you are definitely not what you think you were, okay? So the narrative stays simple. Radiation, magnetism, solar wind, nothing to see here. Okay, now let's take this beyond the physical, see it from the astral perspective. In the astral or dream states, many people report hitting barriers. They try to leave Earth to go beyond, and then they encounter resistance. Sometimes it appears as a grid, sometimes as a dome or a distortion field. These experiences are not imagination. They are perceptions of the same system, just from a different level. The Van Allen belts have an astral counterpart because, again, everything is frequency. So the barrier exists across multiple levels of perception, not just a physical one. That's why even in lucid dreams or astral projection, breaking out of Earth's influence is not always easy because you're still within the field. It's not a prison per se, but it is a controlled experience. Now, it's important to understand something. I don't always, frame this as something purely negative. It's not simply a prison. It's more like a controlled experience environment, a place where consciousness can immerse itself in limitation, contrast, and density. But that doesn't mean it's neutral either. Because once you're inside, the system has its own inertia. It reinforces itself, and it encourages you to stay identified with a limited version of reality. The Van Allen belts are part of that reinforcement. They help maintain the consistency of the experience. So breaking free is not necessarily physical. Here's the key takeaway. You don't escape the system by building a better rocket. You don't escape it by physically traveling through the belts. Because the real barrier is not physical. It's frequency-based awareness. According to Yazzie, the only real way out of this is through expanding consciousness and remembering who you are beyond the body, and then shifting your perception. When your frequency changes, your reality changes. And when your reality changes enough, you are no longer bound by the same rules. The barrier stops being a barrier, because you're no longer operating within the same parameters. So when you hear about the Van Allen belts, don't just think about radiation zones. Think of them as part of a much larger system. A system that includes the moon as a frequency generator, the belts as a containment field, Earth as a controlled experiential environment, and consciousness as the true driver of reality. From this perspective, space is not empty. There is no such thing as empty space. What scientists call a vacuum is full of energy. They can't measure it properly. That alone already breaks the mainstream assumption. What we've been taught is that space is a near perfect vacuum. But here's the explanation, is that it only appears empty because of our limitations, not because it actually is. That connects directly to how I describe 0-point energy. The vacuum is full of potential energy, potential energy that can be tapped into. This is why it can be used as an energy source. So instead of space being nothing, it's actually something full of latent energy, something that can even be tapped into. You can't extract energy from nothing. So space is a reservoir, not a void. Okay? This is where the concept of the ether comes in, which is a huge piece of the puzzle. Ether is the base of everything. It's the medium through which all frequencies propagate. And also, everything exists within the ether, including what we call outer space. Space is not separate from a medium. It exists within one. If ether is the medium through which all energy and frequency moves, then space itself must behave like a medium as well. You see the same pattern when we talk about gravity. Instead of describing gravity as some invisible force acting across empty space, I explain it more like this. Gravity is not a force like that. It's the result of a distortion in the medium. And mass bends the space around it, creating what we interpret as gravity. That only works if space is something that can be bent or distorted. You can't curve nothing. So again, space is something with structure and properties, not emptiness. This becomes even more obvious when I describe how advanced ships move. I make it very clear. Spacecraft are not just pushing through empty space like rockets. Ships do not travel through space like rockets do. They change frequency and match the destination. And more importantly, they manipulate the fabric of space itself. The ship creates a field around it, isolating it from external medium. That external medium is key. It shows that space is something the ship is immersed in, something that can be interacted with, modified, and even temporarily disconnected from. I also explained that inertia is bypassed because the ship is no longer interacting with space in the same way, okay? And that only makes sense if space is something that normally interacts with objects like a medium would. You don't interact with nothing. So again, this reinforces the idea that space behaves more like a field or a fluid-like environment. Another important aspect is how I define density. When Yazi talks about density, she explains that it's not about physical thickness, but about frequency and information. What you perceive as empty space is full of information. You just don't see it. So from this perspective, space is actually highly saturated, not empty at all. It only appears empty because we're not tuned to perceive what's there. Space behaves more like a plasma environment, and energy moves in currents and flows. This points to structure and movement within space. Currents and flows are not concepts you would use to describe a vacuum. They're concepts you use when something is moving through a medium, something that has continuity and interaction. And finally, it's clear that the misunderstanding comes from human perception itself. And since scientists can't go to space in order to study it, they just make things up on their best guess. So humans interpret space as empty because they cannot perceive what is there. So the idea of space being a vacuum is not a fact, but as a limitation in perception and measurement. We're simply not seeing the full picture. When you put all this together, the conclusion becomes very clear. Space is something that contains energy, something that carries frequencies, something that can be bent, manipulated, and interacted with. It is a medium, something with structure, something with flow. So instead of thinking of space as empty nothingness, think about it like a high-density fluid. This is what people are talking about when they talk about the waters above or the firmament, okay? Space is more like a highly energetic, structured field, a kind of non-physical medium that everything exists within. And once you look at it that way, a lot of things seem mysterious, like gravity, propulsion, and energy propagation, start to make a lot more sense. The idea that the Van Allen belts are just radiation is one of those surface level explanations that keeps everybody safely within the boundaries of conventional science. But something far more complex is happening. We live in a reality where physics and consciousness are inseparable, where planetary systems are not just natural formations but engineered environments, and where what we perceive as limitations are actually frequency constraints. Whether you take this literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, it opens up a completely different way of looking at Earth, space, and your place within it. Because if the barrier is frequency, then the key was never outside of you. It was always you.